Hi, everyone watching this, and very welcome to this afternoon's seminar on post-COVID-19 and what will happen in the coming years. We call it the post-COVID-19 a poorer place. We will talk about some of the effects that the pandemic has had on human rights and also on people's lives and livelihood, and also looking a little bit ahead and to talk about what we think will happen when and if the pandemic ceases, and if we're going to be able to go back to a normal life and what it looks like in different parts of the world. I'll just check because I have two different. My name is Anna Wigemark, and I'm the Secretary General of Ordfront, the Swedish Human Rights and Democracy Movement, who's also the host of the Human Rights Forum. And I have a very distinguished panel with me to talk about these issues. Maybe you can wave when I mention your names. I have Alvaro Montenero, from a journalist from Guatemala.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Srirak Pripat from Oslo, but from an organization called Muse, that works with on the rights of artists, freedom of expression for artists, and Ulrika Moder, who is a long title, a director of the Bureau for External Relations and Advocacy at the United Nations Development Programme. I will give you all the possibility to talk a little bit about about your tasks and your organizations when you will be given the floor as we continue this talk this morning. I would like to start with you, Srirak. You work, as I mentioned, at an NGO called Muse. Can you just start telling us a little bit about Muse, what you do, and yeah, in particular what you do? You're muted.
Sorry. Good afternoon and good morning wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Anna, and her organization for inviting Muse to join. Muse is an international independent human rights organization focusing on freedom of artistic expression and cultural rights. So in short, we're looking at human rights related to the arts and culture sector in particular. Every year we monitor censorship around the world, as well as other forms of illegitimate restrictions of artistic freedom. And we publish in a report known as the State of Artistic Freedom Reports. We basically analyze challenges, patterns that happen with artists around the world. We also do advocacy work. After the research is done, we advocate, we work with intergovernmental organizations such as the UN, the EU, and other intergovernmental body, regional body, as well as directly with national government, advocate for the rights of artists, as well as the people working in the culture sector, cultural workers, as we call sometimes. We campaign and we build network and trying to support, provide information, promote positive changes. We also work with partners to support artists at risk, especially those that have life-threatening situation. We provide some small financial support, life-saving support when artists need to flee their own countries to find some safe haven. So those are some of the things that we do in the summary.
Yeah. And just recently, a month ago or so, you published a report concerning the pandemic year 2020. What are the differences, you would say? How does it differ from other years? What kind of challenges has the COVID-19 brought to artists around the world?
Yes, thank you for this question. Certainly because of the pandemic, many of the arts and cultural events has been cancelled, as we know. Most of us are going into lockdowns, performances has been cancelled, concerts, shows, and so on. But very contrary to the general perception, because of this lockdown, censorship during the year should go down and other restrictions should go down because there's not that many shows happening. Research found the opposite. Last year was the highest level of censorship and restrictions of artistic freedom since we record through artistic freedom. And this is mainly because of a number of governments used COVID-19 and pandemic to go after dissident artists or opposing voices. And some use COVID-19 as the pretext to go after those that have been opposing government long before. And this is give additional power and reasons also, while the other groups, artists at risk, those remain targets. Let me just give some example just to give the picture. Number of artists killed last year was almost double compared to the previous year. So that's from 9 artists killed the year before. It was 17 last year. Imprisonment increased by 15%. 71 artists were imprisoned in 2019 that we could find and verified. And last year from 71 to 82. And the most, one of the most alarming, I would say, is the number of artists being prosecuted, being sued on various grounds, and that increased from 23 to 107 in 2020. So that's basically, most of these figures show last year, despite COVID-19, despite the loss of economic incomes for most artists, it was also one of the worst years in terms of artistic freedom.
Can you give us some examples on what are they being charged of? What kind of art is being prohibited? Can you give us a few examples on that?
Yes, indeed. I mean, one of the most frequent used reason is for opposing governments. And when artists oppose government policy, whether they criticize lockdown policy or other policy during the year, and this normally comes in also in terms of insulting head of state. So in European, for example, 17 countries of EU members still have law that protect head of states, which human rights experts has made it very clear that this is inconsistent with international human rights standards. Insulting state symbol, burning flags or make fun of flags and so on, any kind of state symbol. So those artists get sued on these cases, these kind of grounds. Other include for hurting religious feelings, especially when artists do some work questionings about religious values, as well as religious institutions that we live in. LGBT artists were sued on the ground of violating family values or violating the so-called propaganda law or LGBT propaganda law. So these are some of the various grounds. Women in particular, women artists are being sued on the ground of being indecent. And there's certainly questions about what defines indecency. In many laws, these words were left very vague and broad, and that vagueness in return being used against women artists, disproportionately more than men artists when the use of indecency. So there's various, and these are some of the most frequent used reasons to go after artists.
And in your report, if correct me if I'm wrong, but when I look at the sort of the states that have been sort of challenging artists the most, Europe is one of the parts of the world with Africa when it comes to COVID-19 and trying to stop artists from voicing their opinion. Is Europe and Africa normally topping the list, or is this a different year?
Things does change slightly in terms of regional picture. Let me just go, and it's not only Africa and Europe. I think it's the same for North America, have their own challenges. The Middle East and North Africa also have their own challenges, and the number have been quite high also. And I think let's focus on Europe just for a minute. I think in Europe, the situation has turned downwards in the last couple of years, I would say. when we've seen cases in the past. If you ask which country in the world that put artists in prison the most, before 2020, it had been Spain, which imprisoned 14 rappers. And some of them were released last year, and now the number has been dropped down. So that's where you will be surprised to see artists imprisoned in Europe, and higher than the number in Russia, Egypt, or China, Iran, and some of these we know as authoritarian regimes with little level of tolerance of different opinions. And at the same time, I think it should be said that also Europe has turned somewhat nationalistic. Populism have been used in politics, creating us and them attitude, a strong anti-refugee, anti-immigrants. Right-wing parties gain more seats in the parliaments in at least 14 countries in Europe. And these are some of the changing environment in Europe. There's some countries have gag laws restricting freedom of expression, what can and cannot be said. And all of these create an environment where there's little tolerance to different expressions of opinion, whether that's through journalists, artists, as well as other groups who have their own challenge. So that's on Europe's side. And I think for Africa has been, the challenge has been continuing for quite some time, and we've seen little evidence of changes for the better. And there's a number of hotspots here and there that might be changing for each year. Certainly last year, we've seen a number of artists that get into politics. For example, Bobby Wine in Uganda and other countries also similarly. Issues around minorities has always been a challenge in Africa. If you go to concert, you sing the wrong language, the so-called wrong language, because that's not mainstream, because the minority, you might be in trouble also. And likewise, issues around LGBT still relevant for both Africa, Middle East, as well as Europe, where LGBT artists has been targeted in terms of their artwork and themselves as a person. So I think each region tend to have their own challenges, but I think worldwide, I think nationalism, the increased division, the language of us and them that's been spreading has been quite a direct effect on artistic freedom.
I thought, because I didn't mention in the beginning, that we have 2 video clips and messages from 2 different countries. One of them being Zimbabwe and Sakile Sifelani, who is a Women in Politics Support Unit. She works for the Women in Politics Support Unit, and her job is to support and increase the number of female politics and the position of decision making in the country. And we have a message. Josephine, my colleague, will help me with the clip on that, where she talks about how not all of the things, but a couple of things that she wants to stress when it comes to COVID-19 and the challenges in her country. So Josephine, can you air the clip? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sakile Sifelani Ngoma. I'm with Women in Politics Support Unit, WIPSU, in Zimbabwe. WIPSU is an organization that supports and facilitates women as they navigate the corridors of power in elected office, and it also supports women who are seeking to hold public elected office. The context of women and girls' rights in Zimbabwe has been fraught with difficulties, but it's also been characterized by successes in certain areas. I'm going to start with the good news. I think the good news comes around the right to water, the fact that the experiences of women, regardless of whether they are rural women or women who are living in urban communities, women have had one singular experience, that access to water, safe potable water, has been something almost impossible for women. Women access water in very difficult conditions, in the sense that in rural communities, there have been years of underdevelopment and also years of failure to invest in trying to get expanded safe water supplies. And in urban communities, the disinvestment within local authority water delivery systems and also water and sanitation systems has meant that women living in both rural communities and urban communities have to access water at communal access points most of the time. And these communal access points became incredibly congested during the COVID crisis. And yet we know that with water was the one thing, just by a simple act of just washing your hands, you could not only save a life, but you could save a community and a country. And yet women were accessing water, 20-liter buckets, 4 a.m. in the morning, accessing water in communal water points controlled by men, subjected to violence, subjected to rape and other horrendous experiences. And what we were able to do as the women's movement collectively in this country was to table water as a #1 national priority area. And we are beginning to see government roll out programs to answer that question. But of course, we're still a long way off to getting every woman in Zimbabwe to get access to water without the struggles that we're speaking about. But we've gotten a fresh start. The second thing that I think is critical is around the negatives that we saw in the space. And we go back to something that we thought we had, as women in this country, it was a struggle we didn't have to deal with. And that was a struggle around accessing family planning services, in particular contraceptives. And we know that one of the craziest things that happened was that during the crisis, family planning tablets in particular were as expensive as $26, which essentially meant in a country where most people earn the equivalent of $300, for example, your average teacher, we know that women were not able to access $26 to buy one packet, 30-day supply of family planning tablets. What does this mean? Women lost their right to their bodily autonomy. Women lost the right to choose what they did, and their family planning choices were taken away from them. Never mind the chaos of actually having closures of clinics and closures of services and facilities. And so how do we begin to reimagine a world where women have control over their bodies, and that control is prioritized, and it is also something that is supported? But we also saw the chaos around the maternal health care centers, where the conditions under which women were accessing maternal healthcare services, not only because of disinvestment, but because it wasn't a priority area for COVID. Women have horrendous stories of how they were able to give birth or to access neonatal services during that time. It is my hope that the lesson that Zimbabwe gets is my favorite human right, which is the right to human dignity. Because dignity is the only right that protects the way that we feel. And so when we begin to measure the progress of women or the status of women, we need to be able to say, to what extent do women feel better? To what extent do women enjoy these rights as they access them?
I noticed that we were supposed to have a small comment in the chat that if you want to ask questions to us in the panel, use please Q&A, and we'll take your questions as they suit in the discussion or at the end of the discussions. I will turn to you, Ulrika, and talk a little bit. First of all, please tell us a little bit about the UNDP and the work you do, in particular in relation to the pandemic. And then we can talk a little bit what Sakile talks about, access to water, how important that is. But please tell us a little bit more about your organization and how you work with COVID or the pandemic.
Thank you, Anna. Very interesting to listen. And I believe what we are hearing, is really that the COVID-19 is exacerbating a lot of problems and tendencies that we see with regard to increased autocratization, but also with regard to the situation that people are living in poverty face. So UNDP is the United Nations Development Program, and we have a broad mandate actually at the center of the Sustainable Development Goals, because we have been tasked to work with poverty reduction, but also addressing the increasing inequality that we see across the world, both between, but also within countries. We are also working with conflict prevention, with good governance, rule of law and human rights. And we're also actually the agency implementing most of the work within the field of environment and climate change among all UN agencies, because we're present in 170 countries. And with regard to COVID, we have been tasked alongside with WHO, of course, leading the health response, OCHA, which is the humanitarian coordination function, leading the humanitarian response, to lead on the socioeconomic, both assessments, that is what's actually happening in the member states during COVID-19. What kind of shadow pandemics do we see with regard to both human rights, but also the socioeconomic situation, looking then at access to water or broader health issues that we're also coordinating with WHO. So we're assessing the situation on the ground in member states, but we're also supporting and giving technical supports to the UN teams, but also a number of actors in the countries to plan how to address then the situation that countries are facing. Because the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19, they will last for a long time. So we're also talking about investment that would take us beyond recovery and move the sustainable development goals in the right direction, move the human rights situation in the right direction. So while it is a health emergency and also a humanitarian emergency, we are trying to get countries and also the international community to understand the importance of investments that takes us beyond recovery and address these systemic failures that we see with regard to societies that are so apparent because of COVID-19. The lack of health systems, for instance, and the fact that once again the international community seemed to have the ability only to focus on one problem at a time. So what was mentioned in this clip with regard to access to health and the need to look at the broader health situation in a country is something that we have discussed since the very beginning, because we could see this happening, that the investment with regard to addressing COVID would actually take funding out of other really important areas, such as women's health, for instance.
And access to clean water and sanitation is also one of the goals of the development agenda. And can you see that this, because we all have been told to wash our hands thoroughly, artists have been singing about it on TikTok and everything, and sometimes we tend to forget how scarce clean water is all around the world. Can you see a connection, a correlation when it comes to access to clean water and sanitation and the COVID pandemic? And if so, how is the response from states to address this issue?
Yes, certainly. And this speaks, as I was mentioning, to the situation of inequalities. Of course, I mean, the many people living in urban slums, for instance, don't have access to clean water. And I think it's important to know that still an estimated 3 billion people don't have water and soap at home. 900 million children don't have access to water and soap at school, if schools are then open. And 40% of healthcare facilities are not equipped with water and soap and the basic hygiene. So these are numbers that speak to the importance of this. And then, of course, I mean, looking at the situation with regard to WASH, I mean, we're also in a situation where we have to continue to address the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, the planetary crisis, which also affects, of course, the access to water. So there are many different entry points to the work that we need to do with regard to the basic right of access to water.
And Sakila also points to the situation regarding the women's situation, and particularly the kind of violence and threats they are subjected to, also when carrying out their duty to, or their chores to pick up water every day. And this is something also that has been brought up in discussions in Sweden and all over the world about how the pandemic has also exacerbated violence against women. Is this something that you have been looking at as well from the UNDP?
We have, and certainly our sister agency, UN Women, who we're working with also to really understand the situation on the ground, have been looking at this. And I think that you've heard also the Secretary General of the UN speak out loudly, Antonio Guterres, about this shadow pandemic with regard to the situation of women. Women in lockdown, where we see an increase of violence. So UN Women have come out with a number of reports. And as we have worked with our response plans, the socioeconomic response plans, we have had to have a particular gender lens looking at the situation of women, because as was mentioned, I mean, we can see that it's really worsening almost by 20% as compared to men, if we look at different indicators within the range of socioeconomic response plans. So we have really focused on the need both with regard to basic human rights and security of women, but also social and economic rights.
I can ask you the same question more or less, Srirak and Alvaro. Alvaro, let me introduce Alvaro Montenegro. You are a journalist from Guatemala. Can you just present yourself? And you also work for a couple of organizations working for justice in Guatemala. Can you say a few words about that first?
Hi, thank you for this invitation. My name is Alvaro Montenero, and I am a journalist from Guatemala and also a member of different civil society movements, including Justicia Ya, Justice Now, and in coordination effort with Alianza por las Reformas, Alliance for Reform, who are working to strengthen justice in Guatemala and Central America. We warned in 2015 when it take place 20 protests against the former president Otto Perez Molina. He is in jail right now because he had a lot of corruption accusations, and we start monitoring since then the justice system and trying to translate all the political discussions to the people, to young movements, students. So this can give some tools to different people so they can activate, do different works, and artists also. And we work mainly on the communication and social media area.
Yes, thank you. Can do you in any way recognize this presentation about how violence against women has increased during the pandemic? And when it comes to women artists, Srirak, and for you, Alvaro, in your region, is this something you also recognize?
Yes, I think that is happening in many countries. The lockdown creates a more hostile place for women, and the violence against them. At the first days of this year, the crimes against women increase considerably, and provoke movements, a lot of protests here in Guatemala. They were asking, there were like 40 women that were disappeared in the first 30 days of the year. So there was a huge crisis, social crisis here, because this government it has a repression idea of solving problems. So but they're not capturing they're not putting in jail any of the supposedly killers of these women. There were a lot of violence against children also. So this year started with a lot of this social unrest, because the women are tired here. The government is not solving any problems. And the positive of this is that women voices are more heard in the public opinion, but it is still a lot of the justice system is not working very well. So, well, I think it also create a lot of conscience to we men, because we probably are part of a violent society, and we also have like some attitudes that can be kind of violent. So I think this is also important, because it's we're speaking of this, and this has been a theme that is not quite like the media hasn't talked about this in other years. So, like the pandemic is, well, in a certain way, helping these rights can be well in the media and in social media and in young movements. The students have been very vocal, very they have like a lot of rage there, and they're also the student movements are led by women, and this is very important because they're like denouncing violence against women in the universities, accusing some of teachers, professors, and there's like a lot of new narrative against it. Well, some people also said that women are not like legitimate to talk about this, but we must like hear them. We must like reflect about it. We have to like also create our own groups to talk about these problems that are historical problems in most societies, but probably here in Latin America that we have like a very strong culture of well, don't like give women the space they deserve.
Mm. So when you think there will be a sort of many men being engaged in a change, do you see that kind of movement?
I think it's not very easy, and it's not very popular because a lot of men like think they're losing privilege, and they say that this is not like an important issue or is not the most important issue.
Mhm.
But I think it's every day that passes, there are more men thinking this way, and um, I think there are more women also in political charges, in important political charges. So this is also important because, as I said, all universities leaders are women. So they're like, that's very important. That's a great message here because that had never happened before.
Mm.
So they're like saying, well, we fight for justice, we fight anti-corruption, we support anti-corruption movements, but we also are fighting for rights of the women.
Mm. Siddharth, you mentioned before that women artists were also targeted during the pandemic. Can you develop a little bit on that?
Yes, indeed. We recently published two reports. One is the Women and Artistic Freedom Report. That's really collection of analysis of challenges that women artists around the world were facing. And the other one that we focus on women's rights to creativity, especially in the digital age. And what was the common challenge of women's freedom of expression overall has been that we live in a patriarchal society, and there's been normative framework that men are in dominant positions setting rules with unequal relations. Take, for example, women artists last year were restricting their freedom of expression 47% on the ground of indecency. Mm. And these figures are higher than normal, which normally stay at 1/3 or 33, 34% in most of the research we've done. And that was increasing in last year figures during the COVID-19. Indecency has been, again, as I mentioned, this is a vague wording, and it happened in laws of so many countries, and it's been used against women. I think it's worth mentioning that there are a number of women human rights defenders who use arts to fight for women's rights overall, including reproductive rights, fighting against issues around abortion, the body of women that belong to themselves, and that rights are being taken away. And when women and women artists take on these challenges, stand up for their women's rights, they tend to be punished. very often severely in a number of countries. And this has been documented quite thoroughly in our reports. In the digital space, we also have seen in social media a disproportionate censorship or takedown of contents on social media happen to women artists more than men. And in addition, the level of violence against women, whether that's verbal or other forms of threat, also disproportionately affected women artists more than men. So whether death threats, you get rape threats, and other comments such as, I know where you live, I will go to you. These sort of things happen to women artists disproportionately more than men. So those are some of the major research findings. I think this is a long, long way to go. And this is not going to be a tactical change here and there that you know, all of a sudden freedom of expressions of women has all of a sudden increased. I think there's the foundation of this is the norms that has been governing our society, the patriarchal society, the unequal power relation between women and men. So all of this will need to be tackled at the same time.
Mm. Ulrika, would you like to comment on this and also how you work against violence against women in the within the goals, but also I would like to add a question that's from the audience. So I think everyone will see it. There will most probably be an increase of mental illness due to the growth of socioeconomic inequalities in terms of COVID-19. Do you think the SDGs, particularly SDG 3, will be able to address this issue? So I will address that to you, Ulrika, also. But please comment on, if you want, on challenges working with governments and when it comes to violence against women.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's interesting to listen because I think that we see several tendencies at the same time. And the Secretary General of the UN has talked about the need for a pushback against the pushback with regard to women's rights. And this is something that we had seen already ahead of COVID-19. And this is why it's incredibly important to have a strong gender lens as we look at the socioeconomic response plans. And I was mentioning that we are working on this, but still 32 countries out of the countries, the member states having presented response plans actually don't have a gender lens and are looking at this situation. So still a way to go, and with these negative tendencies that we see also, I think, as a result of women taking also a different role in society. So this is also what we believe makes it necessary to push back against the pushback. It's as if women once, pushing that glass ceiling, we see a strong movement pushing back. So it's actually a reaction also of, and I was thinking, these young women or students in Guatemala leading in the university. I think we also must see that there are a lot of women leaders and things are happening. And this is perhaps also why we see this power battle that was mentioned. And we can also see this. And I think it's also important to say that we see a lot of leaders, of course, in the response of COVID-19. 70% of the health workers are female, just to recall that. And we see at community level, regional level, but also national level, a lot of female leadership also, and people really in difficult circumstances voicing then the need to address this. But we also see, and speaking once again about the importance of looking at structural change examples, where women in countries like Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria have joined forces, women in parliament, but also women's movement, and they have taken the opportunity of this exacerbated situation to actually put forward new legislation that would result in greater or stronger legal accountability with regard to gender-based violence and also socioeconomic support packages for women. Now, whether we are going to address mental health or not, I think it's also important to say that the socioeconomic crisis, as I mentioned, is increasing day by day. And we're talking about probably in several countries, not least in sub-Saharan Africa, but across the world, also some middle-income countries that will lose decades of advancements with regard to development. We see less of development finance, less of foreign direct investments, less of remittances, less of ODA coming up also the coming years. And this in times when many countries don't have the possibility to do the kind of investments that a country like Sweden has done throughout the year and the coming years. So I have a real concern that many countries will not be able to address the wider health consequences. I think as an international community, we need to look at this and also include mental health, certainly, because there are also a lot of figures that tells us that this has also increased. WHO are also looking into this. And yes, I mean, we're actually in a discussion with Karolinska Institute as UNDP right now, looking at the governance for health. Because of the need to look at the wider health consequences, then including also mental health. So there will be a discussion, but the funding also needs to be there. And this is a great concern, because one more thing that I would like to mention is, I mean, speaking about dark clouds, we also have an increasing debt situation in many countries that will actually hinder also the possibility for increased investments. That's also happening at the same time. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, there are a lot of, it's kind of a perfect storm right now. And thus the need to look at this from a wider range of factors as we are doing now. A system change needs to take place.
Yeah, well, a follow-up question to that is, it seems like it's very difficult for anyone to look at more than one issue at a time, but it is necessary, because otherwise you'll probably make the wrong decisions also in relating to perhaps the COVID on the pandemic as well. So looking at different sides of the coins and different is very important in all this. We have another message, but from Nicaragua this time, from Lottie Cunningham. And Lottie Cunningham is an award-winning lawyer from the Mosquito Indigenous Group, defending the rights of indigenous people in Nicaragua to their land and resources. And she has a message to us as well.
La situación de las comunidades indígenas con quienes trabajamos como Centro por la Justicia y Derechos Humanos en la Costa Atlántica en Nicaragua se encuentra en una profunda crisis humanitaria. 70% de estas comunidades actualmente sufren una masiva invasión de colonos en sus territorios. Hemos contabilizado más de 49 indígenas asesinados, 54 indígenas heridos y tenemos 4 indígenas desaparecidos y 29 secuestrados. Y la mayoría de los secuestros han sido de las mujeres indígenas. Y la mayoría han sufrido violaciones sexuales. Las instituciones del Estado no han resuelto ningún caso para frenar estas acciones de invasión. Todo ha quedado en impunidad, sumado a lo que ya venían viviendo las comunidades por sus pérdidas continuas de sus territorios. Luego la pandemia del COVID-19, ahora las comunidades se encuentran en una grave situación por los 2 huracanes, Eta e Iota, que impactó gravemente a las comunidades, devastando totalmente a las comunidades. Destruyó los huracanes toda la producción agrícola, sus viviendas. Post-huracán se ha acelerado la invasión de los colonos. Pero por supuesto que esto también tiene que ver con un año de proceso electoral. Uno de los llamados que nosotros hacemos a organizaciones internacionales y a la comunidad internacional también, estamos solicitando visibilizar la situación de los pueblos indígenas y tener acciones concretas de incidencia ante los órganos de tratados de la Carta de Naciones Unidas, como los procedimientos especiales de la ONU. Esa incidencia es la que va a apoyar, a visibilizar la situación de los pueblos indígenas y particularmente las mujeres indígenas que día a día luchan por su vida, por su territorio. Una acción concreta donde el Estado de Nicaragua asuma con responsabilidad su obligación en materia de derechos humanos y derechos para los pueblos indígenas.
Follow-up question to the clip, Alvaro. Can you explain to us who are not familiar with the situation a little bit more about the invasion of settlers that Lotte is talking about, so just so we understand the situation?
Well, I think all the land in Guatemala and in different countries of Central America is not legally regulated, and this causes that create a lot of conflicts about this. And there's a lot of people saying, "This is my land. This is my land," and the indigenous population is very affected of this no regulation, because there's a lot of powerful or businessmen have taken some indigenous land. This is an historic conflict. I think right now the pandemic has affected mostly the poorest indigenous community, and in Guatemala, for example, more than 60% of the population is indigenous. I think also these hurricanes, Eta and Iota, has also affected Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala in a moment that when the pandemic is still very critical. So these both crises mixed, and this also caused an economic and social problem that, for example, in Guatemala, this create two protests on November 2020 against a corrupt budget that was approved by the president and the Congress. So the people went to the streets, a lot of students, because they were very angry against this new budget that was approved for this year. And the people is saying, well, this budget do not reflect the necessities of the people. They're not giving enough money for the hurricanes crisis, and they're not giving also money for the solving the health problem. So I think these are problems of all the region. The justice system are very weak. So if you demand justice, if you say, well, this is not this they're taking my land, but the justice system don't work. The justice system works protecting the powerful, the government, and the most rich people. So the indigenous and the people that live very far of the cities are unprotected by the laws of the countries, and also is very we're very worried because the activists, the indigenous activists, and other kinds of activists, as also journalists and some judicial officers that are independent, they have been criminalized and they're victim of repression, of policies, of the different. Well, they're putting them in jail, so there's a lot of lawsuits against um, different indigenous leaders. So the ones that are fighting for the land to protect the rivers, they're putting them in jail. So I think the land is a historic problem in Guatemala and Central America. And these problems are not being discussed by the government because they know that a lot of illegal um, wealths are created by taking some land that are from these indigenous. They're building a lot of hydropower without without asking to the communities if this is well to this area. So there's a lot of problems of this, and there's a lot of investment of the of powerful countries that are also like seeing to the other side because they have a lot of money in this well, investment as mining or hydropowers.
Yeah. Ulrika, would you say that indigenous people are neglected in sort of the struggle against COVID-19, or is there, as they are in so many other cases, or how do you recognize these the message from Lottie?
No, yeah, certainly. I mean, what we have seen and what we have discussed also throughout this session is the increased discrimination, and certainly indigenous communities have suffered from that. But this is really also, once again, I mean, the example of the perfect storm. I mean, this historic struggle of land in Central America and the lack of rule of law, and then also the number of hurricanes that we have seen increasing throughout the years. So I think that the struggle for land will continue and be even more difficult the coming years because also of the hurricane season changing also as a result of climate change. So I think there is a need, and this is also something that we have been discussing in each and every country where we've been addressing the socioeconomic situation, also to look at discrimination, because we have seen discrimination increase throughout the year.
Mm. Alvaro, how would you describe the response from the Guatemalan government when it comes to the pandemic in general? If you pinpoint a few things? You're muted.
I think the corruption and the weak justice system favor the government, and this creates a lot of problems, like like a very poor access to vaccinates, and these weak health systems um, that they're stealing a lot of money that has to go to hospitals, and there's a lot of different accusations of this, and the attorney general, instead of investigating, she is protecting the president and his allies. So as it doesn't matter that the prince denounce a lot of corruption, but nothing is happening there. Also, a lot of people near the government have made a great business in the pandemic, and they also have been like they have privilege on getting the vaccinates for them. We in Guatemala has been, or only 150,000 people have been vaccinated. So there's a lot of people is saying vacunas ya is like the hashtag because we're saying like we need these vaccinates, and the president right now he is in Spain doing different things, nothing. He take a picture with the king, and we're saying, well, where is the president? He's not in the country in this crisis. I think also it's very important that this pandemic has been seized by Central American governments to promote authoritarian politics, causing more repression against human rights defender and independent press.
We only have a few minutes left and so many things to talk about. So I will actually go ahead and ask you to sort of sum up a little bit. And while doing so, there's a question just to repeat. I'm sure you know this by heart, Ulrika. There's a question. Will you please repeat how many children who doesn't have access to water in school? There was a question. But looking ahead, what needs to be done? Isn't there a risk? We have now 3 million people died in the pandemic, but there are even more, some say, who have died from famine, malnutrition during the pandemic. And then the risk of many countries not getting vaccine and to all the people in maybe a year or 2 or 3 years, or maybe not at all, some say. Will the gap, Ulrika, between the richer and the low-income countries increase, and what will then happen? And what will you see as necessary steps for the international community to take? That's my question to you, Ulrika.
Thank you. And I think it's one of the most important questions, because we need to address the increasing inequality, because I think that the increasing inequality relates also to what Chirac talked about. I mean, the increasing nationalism. People need to believe that there is a hope for the future, and having a situation where also middle-income countries or the middle class in different countries are kind of slipping back, falling back into poverty because of loss of jobs and so on, will actually create even more of this environment where we can have these racist sentiments and anti-democratic, anti-human rights sentiments increase even more than we've seen today. So I believe that addressing increasing inequalities is incredibly important, and that needs to be at the heart of the response, both between countries and then, of course, looking at the investments that needs to take place, but also within countries. And there, of course, we need to look at how we can create the space then for the investments to take place, and how we can build, of course, health system, but also social protection systems. We have not mentioned today the digital divide that is actually one of the major hindrances when we speak about the future and addressing inequalities. So building strong health systems, strong social protection systems, but also investing in the digital response is important. And then, of course, what I mentioned in the beginning, governance, but then also really integrating into that also the importance of rule of law and strengthening different actors that needs to be there in order to uphold a rule of law and the improvement of human rights in countries. And then I would say also, of course, greening the recovery response. I mean, looking at the hurricane season in Central America, we need to address also the climate crisis at the same time as we address these different areas that I've mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. Alvaro and Chirac, what do you think about the future, and when it comes to for example, the rights to freedom of expression for artists, and the but not all, but also so many artists that have lost their jobs, their livelihood, and how will they sort of how will the future be for them? And Alvaro, when it comes to the restrictions in your country and the corruption, what do you see will be necessary for the international community to do in order to, is there anything the international community can do? Slirak, would you like to comment first?
Yes, thank you. Certainly, I think the pandemic situation has made things very particular challenges. The issues of being used as pretext has been continued. I think going forward, in order to improve the situation, I think the bottom line for us is also we need to make amendment of some of the laws that has been used, and especially laws that are inconsistent with international human rights standards in the first place. As I mentioned from the beginning, laws related to insulting head of state, symbol of states, or insulting president. In some countries, you can't insult army. When this is one of the human rights that you can criticize people in power and hold them to account. It is a part of the democracy process. And also laws related to LGBT propaganda laws and vague wording of public moral. So that's very first chunk, I would say, the continuous work to work on this. The bad news is there are not many civil society organizations working for reforms of laws, and it's heavily relying on parliamentarians of each country, or let's say the EU parliamentarian for the EU case and others. So there's a need to really build capacity for civil society to advocate effectively also that in situations like this, you need to work collaboratively and not using name and shame and other kind of protesting. So various tactics that needs to be used in order to improve situation. And then thirdly, I would say the needs to really bring arts and culture together and really form a network that emphasize on action, activism, and advocate together. And I think maybe unlike journalists, I would say generally, artists are not very good at organizing themselves together. When you compare to journalists, where there are international association protecting journalists, the mechanism to advance to protect journalists has been more advanced, at least 10, 20 years compared to protecting artists. The case of SLAP mechanism, which is one of the mechanisms to prevent journalists from being sued for doing their work, has not been used for artists, for example. So some of these mechanisms that artists and arts and culture movement will need to learn from protection of journalists in order to actually include and really make that to a similar level. And I think finally, it is important for all of us individually also that we take hold of the challenge, that this is one of the most important challenging time when it comes to freedom of expression. And if we're not going to do anything, our digital space that we believe we have the right to privacy, all of this will come back to us, and we're shrinking that space for us even more. How you say what you think, how you feel, how you communicate will be increasingly restricted if you're not taking any action. So it's important for all of us individually to also take part in campaign, in action, in make your voice heard, and really push back, create this space for free expression.
Alvaro, you will be given the last word in this discussion. What do you see coming, and what do you think the international community should do?
Well, I think it is very important for the international community to be aware that the government is aggravating the crisis, and that is why the international community can send some message of worrying of this. We have very few vaccinates, and also the international community probably can help us to get more, and also the logistics of vaccinate are very bad. They could support us in making a better vaccination strategy. Today, we and some civil society organizations will be talking to the vice president about this importance. For us, it's also important to reject the criminalization of journalists, activists, and also judicial independent officials. I think these kind of events are very important to publicize our problems and that the governments are not giving positive results. And the messages of support for the fight against corruption are also very important for us. The United States, with the new administration, has issued messages against the government's decisions to weaken the justice system, because that leads to more corruption and less capacity for the state to solve the problems. I think if international community can support this kind of message is also very important. And also I would like to thank Sweden, that has been a very important ally for protecting the human rights, and we're very grateful for that.
Thank you all so much. We have passed through our limits by 7 minutes, I hope, but there are still some with us. What we need to bring with us, of course, is to be able to look at many different aspects at the same time, and not let the pandemic take over all the discussions, and at least not hide violations and corruption in countries, and to try to overcome or lower the gap between the rich and low-income countries. There are many challenges ahead. So thank you so much, Zirak, Alvaro, and Ulrika, for being part of this discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.